Hey, what's up, everybody? This is Nate from Black Gold. In this video today, I'm going to be going over our Underground Scalper. It's one of the latest indicators that we've put out. Our community is absolutely loving it. All right, let's go ahead and let's dive in. All right, guys, so here's the first look at the Underground Scalping indicator. It looks like a lot, but I'll go through each thing step by step because I promise you, it is super, super easy to use. Everybody in our community is using it. And once you figure it out, it's unbelievably easy to use. All right, a couple of things about this indicator. Number one, it's a VWAP-based indicator. All right, so it's an indicator that's based upon volume-weighted average price. All right, so the theory and concept behind this, number one, is how can we make an indicator that is simple and easy for everybody to use, and it's based upon market fundamentals. All right, so you may have heard the saying before, all roads lead back to VWAP. Okay, because institutions oftentimes trade around VWAP, right? They trade where the volume is. All right, and so we've kind of combined different confluences and VWAP in combination with supply and demand in order to be able to make this indicator and make it sustainable over time. If an indicator isn't based upon market fundamentals, it's probably not going to work over time. All right, so let's kind of look at this whole session here step by step. All right, now normally we trade during the New York session, all right, but this indicator can hold up during the Asia and the London session as well. All right, obviously requires some volume, some volatility. No move is confirmed without volume. All right, but here we have the start of the session here. Now the indicator gave us a buy. So now I want to kind of step into what each of these things are. All right, we've talked about the indicator. All right, we know it's a VWAP-based indicator. All right, now what are each of these things? All right, what is this red and green and what is this blue line? All right, so obviously going up the middle here, we have VWAP. All right, VWAP's going up the middle here. You throw up any VWAP indicator. All right, it's going to look like that. So it's where volume, where the most volume of the session is. It's where price most of the time likes to return back to. All right, and then we have this lower cloud and we have this upper cloud. All right, so this is where we take the fundamentals of supply and demand and we put them together. All right, and so the clouds are taking into account the VWAP indicator, where price has been, and it's looking at, well, where would areas of supply and demand be? All right, so the red cloud is our supply area, the green cloud is our demand area, meaning when we enter into either of these clouds, there is a probability that there's going to be potential reversal or it's going to push through. All right. But a lot of times, since price likes to return back to VWAP, all right, we have these clouds to kind of dictate where are the areas that price would like to return back to, or where would it start to maybe get some resistance. All right. And so we have VWAP, we have the upper and lower cloud. We then have these outer bands. All right. And again, these outer bands are also based upon VWAP and they're based upon where volume has been for the session. So it's taking into account the supply and demand areas. All right. And then it's kind of expanding out and creating a second band VWAP, all right, to see where volume could go up to or where it could go as low to. All right. So that's like the indicator on your screen. And now what about this box over here? All right. So this is part of the setup inside of your trading plan. All right. So if you've looked at any strategy, ever considered any strategy, all right, there's a certain set of confluences that have to happen before you take a trade. All right. The saying that we always say is if this, then that. All right. If you do not trade if this, then that, then you are trading with a crystal ball and you're trying to predict the market. All right. But again, instead of just having a bunch of different indicators up here, how can we create a confluence list that makes it so simple? It's on your screen. You can see exactly when and where to take trades. All right. And it's right there on your screen. All right. And so we have two different conditions for trades. We have scalping conditions and we have full trade setup. All right. So the scalping conditions are where, they are what they say they are. They're scalps. Right. They're not meant to be probably full long-term trend moves. They're meant to be scalps. All right. So we have a certain EMA on a certain time frame and then a stochastic being crossed on a certain time frame. Those are our scalping conditions along with crossing inside and outside the supply and demand zones. All right, so those are simple scalping conditions. Now, when both conditions are met, you will see two fire symbols. If conditions are not met, you will see two X symbols. All right, now for the full trade setup, this is adding in another confluence, all right, that may yield more of a full trade setup where we actually might be getting a little bit of a bigger move here. All right, and so when all of those are met, all of them are fires. When not all of them are met, all right, you see X's. Now, there might be one, there might be two that are met sometimes. So you kind of have to dictate, depending upon the conditions, where you want to take trades. But based upon probabilities, if all of these are met, all right, we've gotten a buy or sell the indicator. all right, then there's a good probability that it's going to be a winning trade. So the buy and the sell aren't necessarily based upon the full trade setups here. All right, but in combination with the buy or the sell signal with the confluence checklist, right, this indicator is literally unstoppable. All right, so we have different trainings inside of our Discord, all right, about different conditions that you might want to, that you want to see in order for the indicator to work well. Again, under certain conditions, scalping is not going to work very well. Okay, under like large trend moves days, all right, there's not going to be a lot of scalping, right? And so, but the point is that you have this confluence checklist, all right, that's based upon market fundamentals, all right, and a very simple and easy to recalculate indicator that tells you exactly when to get in. All right. And then we also have the back testing feature. Now, the back testing feature is looking over the last 100 trades. Now, that's including every time frame. So it's looking at London, it's looking at Asia. So depending on what you set your take profit and your stop loss as, that you can do that in the settings. Depending on what you set that as is going to dictate that win rate. All right. But we give that in there just so that you can see it over time. All right. And be able to back test everything, inside of the indicator. All right, so let's look at a couple of trades here. All right, and then again, starting here at the Asia session, we got a buy, pretty much right off the bat that worked out really well. All right, and then we got our first sell up here. Okay, it's showing up down there. Let's use the pen. There we go. All right, we got our first sell up here for about 64 ticks to the downside. All right, now we got a sell here on the indicator. All right, we would need to go in replay mode to actually see if all the checklist conditions met or which ones were met, if the scalping conditions or the full trade up or the full trade setup were met. All right, so again, can work very well during Asia and during London sessions. Now let's go over here and look at the New York session. Now, contextually speaking, gold was moving down here. All right, so starting at the start of the New York session, you'll notice we really didn't get any trades here. And again, no trades really inside the New York session. We got our first buy indication down here. All right, now again, this is a scalping indicator. All right, and although we got the buy upon the closure here, all right, still went up for about 44 ticks to the upside. All right, now contextually speaking, gold's moving down, so buys were a little bit more high risk. You learn about that inside of our Discord and inside of our trainings, where we're looking for certain conditions for the scalper to be met, and then as well, if we look back on this buy signal, were all those conditions met? All right, but still 44 ticks to the upside. All right, on this buy here, if we just like blindly followed these buy and sell signals, 45 ticks to the upside with very little downside. All right, and again, buy here to the end of the session, about 90 ticks to the upside. It would have taken forever, but this is gold, so it's going to take forever. All right, but still with very little downside. All right, so if we look at like the total downside that we took here, our total downside was about 25 to 27 ticks. I mean, 27 isn't even too big, probably about 25 ticks. All right, for a 90 tick move up. All right, now we're not in replay mode. All right, so again, we would need to see, okay, well, which of these conditions were actually met over here for this trade. But the point is that you have the indicator giving you buys based upon the conditions that it's seeing in the market, and you have the confluence checklist. So before taking a trade, you can literally go, okay, we're getting the buy signal. Are all of these fires lit up, or is there one X? Is there two X's? All right, or is the scalping condition lit up? All right, so maybe this would be just good for a scalp, and then we can see if the full trade setup comes in. All right, we can look at the next day. I mean, we can look at Asia here, and since Asia ranged, all right, we have buy. This buy here worked. This buy here, this sell here worked. No buy here, but this sell here worked. This sell here worked, again, for a really solid scalp. All of these probably met under the scalping conditions. But again, let's go over here and look at the New York session. All right, again, pre-New York, probably had some news here at 8:30. All right, but then we look where this sell came in. All right, this sell came in all the way down here for 87 ticks to the downside, with probably about 15 to 20 ticks 15 to 20, I mean, not even 10 ticks in risk. All right, we got this buy on this candle here for 71 ticks on the way up before we had a short reversal. All right, in totality of the move, like if you were holding a runner, in totality, you got 94 ticks to the upside. All right, again, pretty much no downside here. All right, and then going on later in the session, again, the moves get a little bit smaller because volume's getting lower. All right, but 20 ticks to the upside here. 27 ticks to the upside here. All right, 36 ticks to the upside here. And to the end of the session, about 20 ticks to the downside. Again, volume's getting smaller, so the moves are going to get smaller. All right, but that's why I kind of wanted to look across the board at different sessions. That was gold. All right, and this is traded on the 5-minute. All right, but we can look over here at ES2 and see the same thing. Now, ES and NASDAQ are moving into a downtrend. All right, let's see what's today's date. This was Monday the 25th. ES and NASDAQ are moving into a downtrend. All right, now we can see we got this first sell here. All right, that did pull back about 10 ticks. All right, but we can see regardless if we had our stop higher than 10 ticks, all right, this continued on to 40 ticks, about 45 ticks to the downside before making any kind of reversal. All right, now you can see we even got these buys here. All right, 10 tick buy. Again, this is during Asia, 15 tick buy. During Asia, S&P does pretty much nothing. All right, 6 ticks. So you're probably not going to want to trade S&P during Asia. I mean, I don't really know who would trade S&P during Asia. NASDAQ would probably be the best thing to trade during Asia. All right, but I ain't trading S&P during Asia because it's so slow. All right, but let's take a look here at about the New York session as well. So we got a quick buy here on the New York session. All right, about 13 ticks to the upside. Volume's still pretty low here, but here volume kicks in, all right, at the New York session. And then look at this sell. So we got this sell. It would have been executed about right here. Okay, all the way to the downside for 94 ticks, okay, with very little pullback because it would have been executed here. So would have been maybe about 10 to 20 ticks in terms of a pullback. All right, so even though we're trending down, again, contextually speaking, these would have been riskier buys. All right, because again, the point is not to take every single trade that the indicator gives you, right? We would have also wanted to see these conditions, all right, these conditions met, and these automatically change, all right, the EMA, all right, the stochastic, the scalping conditions, and the full trade setup. All right, in real time, these will change. All right, but the point is not to take every single trade, all right, but the indicator is trying to create the most high-profile trade. So that one still would have worked if you were treating it as a scalp. This one, definitely an L. Right here. All right, but again, contextually speaking, the market's moving down, so there's not really a huge reason to take buys. All right, here towards about 1 o'clock, we have our first kind of reversal candle. All right, gave us about 20 ticks to the upside. All right, again, probably only the scalping conditions were met inside of these conditions, probably not the full trade setup. All right, and then we have the end of the session here. Again, choppiness back and forth, so there's really not going to be a lot of crazy good trades here. All right, it's about 18 ticks to the upside here. All right, 14 ticks down here. All right, and again, it is a scalping indicator. All right, so that's what it's meant to do. It's meant to give scalps, but there is also the opportunity for full big and larger trade setups. All right, so let's look at the S&P during a normal market session here again. All right, again, we want to look at New York. I don't want to look at Asia. All right, but here, same thing. All right, this is during London time. All right, so about 22 ticks to the downside here. 23 ticks to the upside here. Okay, 18 ticks to the downside here. This one probably failed because this one was pretty quick, about 10 ticks to the downside. All right, now the indicator did not give us a sell up here, and it's not always going to give us a sell before these big, massive moves because there were no conditions that were met inside the indicator. All right, but contextually speaking, we knew that ES and NASDAQ have been moving down. All right, so still very viable, but again, the conditions there were not met. So therefore, it's not going to give you a sell. All right, and again, we don't want to take every single trade. Now, everything I was showing you here was purely based upon these signals themselves, not based upon the confluence checklist. All right. So imagine using this in real time where you're getting the signals, but you can also refer to the confluence checklist where you're looking to see, okay, well, what's the probability here of this trade working? You can look at your confluences. All right. You can look at the chart and you can look at the buy and sell signal and see if this is a really viable trade for you during your trading time. All right. And again, we're not trying to take every single trade. We're taking the trades that make the most sense for us. All right. We can look at NASDAQ as well and see pretty much the same thing. Now, NASDAQ kind of moves and whips back and forth. Okay. So some of these trades, even on the downtrends, all right, can give some pretty significant ticks to the upside. All right. So this one here, 125. And what was the downside here? Depending on where we got in, it's about 50. So it's about a 2-to-1 trade, but that's in a downtrend on a buy. All right, we can look over any full session. All right, and again, Asia's going to have its own set of things going on with it. All right, but we can look over any sessions and see kind of either these micro scalps or these full trade setups. All right, again, we can go in replay mode and we can go through and look and see if the fire symbols actually pop up for our scalping conditions or our full trade setups. Again, those change in real time. All right, everybody, that is an overview of the Underground Scalper. All right, again, the primary indicator that everybody in our community uses. All right, now you've seen what I've done here on the screen. We looked at a couple of sessions, but I want you to be able to see it for yourself. If you're not in our community already, or you don't have the Underground Scalper, you've never heard of it before, but hey, this is something that seems really interesting. Okay, if you go into our Discord, I'll put the link here and I'll put the link down below. If you go into our Discord, all right, and you submit a ticket and say something like surprise, 7-day offer, whatever. All right, you can try this indicator 7 days totally free. All right, so we'll set you up with this indicator. You don't have to take my word for it. You can go in there and you can try out this indicator for yourself. Try out the strategy and put it to the test. Paper trade with it. Once you learn it, sort of prop with it, you can do that all in 7 days. All right, so when you sign up for a 7-day offer, you get the trainings on take profits and stop losses. You get the trainings on the market context, on what conditions we want to look for. You get all that for free, as well as the Underground Scalper discussion inside of Discord. So join in Discord, try out this indicator for 7 days, all right, and let me know what you think. Hopefully this was helpful to you guys, and we'll see you in there. Bye for now.